A man closes his eyes in a cramped apartment on the Upper West Side. The year is 1948, and outside his window, New York City buzzes with post-war energy and economic uncertainty. For exactly 4 minutes, he sits in silence, not in meditation, not in prayer, but in something far more radical. He assumes the feeling of wealth flowing to him like water from a spring. He feels it as real, as natural, as inevitable as breathing. Within 3 weeks, money begins arriving from sources he never expected. A forgotten investment pays dividends. A business opportunity presents itself. A debt he had written off gets repaid with interest. This is not a story about luck or coincidence. This is about the most fundamental law governing human experience, one that operates whether you understand it or not, whether you believe in it or not. The man in that apartment understood something that most people spend their entire lives never discovering, that imagination is not merely a faculty of the mind, but the very creative power of existence itself. He knew that what you assume to be true about yourself and your world becomes true, not through some mysterious external force, but through the natural operation of consciousness itself. The boundary between what we call inner and outer reality is nothing more than a convention, a habit of thought that keeps us trapped in limitation. Every day, millions of people experience the creative power of assumption without recognizing it. They assume they cannot afford something, and they find themselves unable to afford it. They assume others will reject them, and they encounter rejection. They assume life is hard, and they struggle. Yet when someone tells them they can consciously direct this power toward what they want, they dismiss it as wishful thinking. What you're about to discover challenges everything you have been taught about the nature of reality, success, and human potential. The man in that apartment was not using positive thinking or visualization in the way most people understand these terms. He was engaging in something far more profound, the conscious direction of the creative power that shapes all experience. He understood that feeling is the secret, not emotion, not sentiment, but the feeling of already being what you want to be, of already having what you want to have. The question that haunts the rational mind is this: how can something that exists only in imagination affect the physical world? How can 4 minutes of mental activity alter the flow of money, opportunities, and circumstances? The answer lies not in defying the laws of nature, but in understanding the deepest law of all, that consciousness is the only reality, and what you are conscious of being, you become. From the small island of Barbados came a man who would revolutionize the understanding of human potential and the nature of reality itself. Born into modest circumstances, he began his adult life as a dancer, entertaining audiences with his physical grace and artistic expression. Yet beneath the surface of this conventional beginning, a deeper calling stirred. Water flows according to natural law, seeking its own level, moving around obstacles, finding the path of least resistance. When you assume abundance with the naturalness of water seeking its course, money flows to you according to the same principle. Not because you have manipulated external circumstances, but because you have aligned your consciousness with the natural flow of prosperity that already exists within the infinite possibilities of creation. The secret has always been simple. Feel yourself to be what you want to be, and you will be it. Assume the feeling of your wish fulfilled, and your assumption will harden into fact. Live in the consciousness of abundance, and abundance will manifest in your experience. This is not promise or possibility. This is the natural operation of consciousness itself. As you close your eyes tonight and assume the feeling of your desire fulfilled, remember that you are not hoping for something to happen. You are not wishing for circumstances to change. You are recognizing what is already true in consciousness and allowing that truth to manifest in experience. The 4 minutes you spend in this assumption are not separate from your life. They are the creative foundation upon which your entire life is built. The water flows because water knows its nature. When you recognize your nature as consciousness, the creative power that shapes all experience, your abundance flows with the same naturalness. This is the secret that has been hidden in plain sight, the truth that has been preserved through centuries of mystical teaching, and the recognition that transforms not just your circumstances, but your understanding of what it means to be human. You are consciousness, dreaming itself into form through whatever you assume to be true. When you awaken to this truth, every limitation dissolves, every possibility opens, and the water of abundance sea flows freely through the channel of your assumptions. This is your inheritance, your birthright, and your destiny, not as something you must earn or achieve, but as something you must simply recognize and accept. The choice is always yours in every moment with every assumption. Choose consciously, assume lovingly, and watch as the world transforms itself to match the reality you have dared to claim as your own. The external world of performance and applause could not satisfy the yearning within him to understand the fundamental principles governing human experience. His journey toward mystical understanding began through an encounter that would reshape his entire worldview. An Ethiopian rabbi, a teacher of the hidden wisdom traditions, recognized in him the capacity for deeper understanding. For 5 years, this teacher guided him through the profound texts and practices of esoteric wisdom, introducing him to truths that had been preserved for centuries in mystery schools and mystical traditions. The education he received went far beyond religious doctrine or philosophical theory. He learned to read the Bible not as historical narrative, but as psychological drama. Every character representing an aspect of human consciousness, every story revealing the mechanics of how consciousness creates experience. Abraham was not a historical figure, but the awakening of faith in consciousness. Moses was not a lawgiver, but the disciplined mind that leads consciousness out of limitation into freedom. Jesus was not a person, but the realized human being who understands that imagination is the creative power of existence. This ancient wisdom tradition taught that consciousness is the only reality, and that what you are conscious of being becomes your experience. The external world that appears so solid and independent is actually the reflection of internal states of consciousness. Change your internal state, change what you assume to be true about yourself, and the external world must change to match it. This is not metaphor or symbol, but the literal truth about how reality operates. What emerged from these years of study was not another religious system, but a practical understanding of the creative power that every human being possesses. The teacher who guided him emphasized that true spiritude. All knowledge is not about worship or devotion to external deities, but about recognizing your own consciousness as the God power that creates your world. When you assume something to be true and persist in that assumption until it feels natural, the entire universe conspires to make it so. The wisdom traditions he studied revealed that human beings are not victims of circumstance, but unconscious creators of their own experience. Most people create by default, allowing their assumptions to be shaped by external conditions, past experiences, and the opinions of others. But those who understand the law can create by design, consciously choosing what to assume about themselves and their possibilities. This understanding separated him forever from conventional religious teaching. Instead of asking people to have faith in external gods, he taught them to recognize the God power within their own imagination. Instead of promising rewards in an afterlife, he showed them how to create heaven on earth through the conscious direction of their assumptions. The mystic of Manhattan was born not from religious conversion, but from the discovery of the creative power that had been hidden in plain sight. The law of assumption operates on a principle so simple that the sophisticated mind often overlooks it. Whatever you assume to be true about yourself becomes true in your experience. This is not about positive thinking, affirmations, or visualizing future goals. This is about assuming the feeling of already being what you want to be and living from that assumption until it hardens into fact. Most people confuse assumption with hope or desire. They hope things will change, they desire different circumstances, they wish for better conditions. But hoping, desiring, and wishing all imply that what you want exists outside of you in the future, dependent on external conditions. Assumption is the opposite. When you assume something, you take it for granted as already true. You live from the reality of it, not toward the possibility of it. The secret lies in understanding that feeling is the measure of assumption, not the feeling of emotion, not excitement, enthusiasm, or passion, but the feeling of naturalness, of knowing something is true without question. When you assume you are wealthy, you feel wealthy not as an emotion, but as a state of being. When you assume you are successful, success feels natural, inevitable, already accomplished. This is where most people fail in their attempts to change their circumstances. They try to feel excited about their goals, to generate enthusiasm for their dreams, to create positive emotions about their desires. But excitement and enthusiasm actually reinforce the gap between where you are and where you want to be. True assumption feels calm, natural, and inevitable, like knowing your own name or the color of your eyes. The mechanism operates through a process that modern psychology calls selective attention, but which operates at levels far deeper than conscious awareness. When you assume something to be true, your consciousness begins to Notice evidence that supports that assumption while filtering out evidence that contradicts it. Your behavior naturally aligns with your assumption without conscious effort. Opportunities that match your assumption become visible where they were invisible before. But the law of assumption goes beyond psychology. It operates at the level of what quantum physicists call the observer effect, the principle that consciousness affects the behavior of matter at the most fundamental level. When you assume something about yourself, you're not just changing your psychology, you're changing your relationship to the field of infinite possibility that surrounds all experience. The reason most manifestation techniques fail is that they approach the process from the wrong direction. They begin with the external world and try to manipulate it through mental techniques. True assumption begins with consciousness itself, with recognizing that what you are conscious of being is what you experience. Change your consciousness and the world must change to reflect it. 4 minutes becomes significant not because of any magical property of time, but because sustained assumption requires focused attention. Most people's assumptions fluctuate constantly, influenced by external conditions, other people's opinions, and their own habitual patterns of thought. 4 minutes of unwavering assumption repeated consistently begins to establish a new baseline of consciousness, a new normal that the subconscious mind accepts as true. The practice itself is deceptively simple. You assume the feeling of your wish fulfilled, not as something you want to happen, but as something that has already happened in consciousness. You live in that assumption, think from it, feel from it, until it becomes more real to you than your current circumstances. Then you watch as the world rearranges itself to match your assumption. This understanding transforms the relationship between mind and matter, between consciousness and experience, between what is internal and what is external. The external world becomes recognized as the shadow cast by consciousness, real but secondary. The primary reality is what you assume to be true about yourself, and everything else follows from that. The technique that transforms assumption from abstract concept into practical reality unfolds through a precise understanding of consciousness states. The 4-minute protocol is not arbitrary timing, but the recognition that sustained assumption requires a specific quality of attention, one that transcends ordinary waking consciousness, yet remains distinct from sleep. The state you must enter is what can only be described as akin to sleep, that drowsy, peaceful condition when the barriers between imagination and reality dissolve. In this state, the critical faculty that normally judges and evaluates your mental images becomes quiet. The rational mind that insists on analyzing how your desire could possibly manifest steps aside. What remains is pure consciousness, receptive and creative, ready to be impressed with whatever you assume to be true. Here lies the crucial distinction that separates this understanding from every other approach to changing circumstances. You are not visualizing future events. You are not imagining processes unfolding. You are not seeing yourself working toward goals. Instead, you are assuming the feeling of already being what you want to be, of already having what you want to have. The visualization is not of getting money. It is of already being the person who has money, who expects money, who naturally attracts financial abundance. The feeling you cultivate is not excitement about future possibilities, but the calm naturalness of present reality. When you truly assume wealth, you feel wealthy in the same unconscious way you feel your own identity. You do not think about being yourself, you simply are. Similarly, when assumption becomes complete, you do not think about being wealthy, you simply know that you are. Most people, when they attempt this practice, make the fundamental error of trying to convince themselves of something they do not believe. They sit with their eyes closed, repeating affirmations or generating visualizations, while their deeper consciousness remains unchanged. The subconscious mind, which is where true assumption must take root, cannot be fooled by surface-level mental gymnastics. The art lies in persistence without effort, in gentle consistency, rather than forceful concentration. You assume your wish fulfilled the way you might recall a pleasant memory, not by straining to see it clearly, but by resting in the feeling of it. You allow the images to come naturally, trusting that whatever arises in this receptive state carries the creative power to manifest in your experience. The 4 minutes serve another crucial function. They establish a boundary between ordinary consciousness and creative consciousness. When you set aside this specific time, you signal to your deeper mind that something important is happening. The ritual aspect, the consistent timing, the quiet environment, the deliberate shift in consciousness activates what psychologists call state-dependent learning, where the same neurological patterns become associated with the same outcomes. During these 4 minutes, you live completely in your assumption. If your desire is financial abundance, you assume the feeling of having more than enough enough money. You might imagine paying bills easily, making purchases without concern, or simply feeling the security that comes with financial freedom. But you do not imagine these things as future events. You experience them as present reality. The money is already flowing to you like water because you have assumed the consciousness of someone to whom money flows naturally. The repetition of this practice creates what neuroscientists call neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new neural pathways and connections. Each time you assume your wish fulfilled, you strengthen the neural networks associated with that reality while weakening the networks associated with limitation. Over time, abundance becomes your default state of consciousness rather than something you have to work to achieve. Why money responds to this principle with such apparent ease reveals something profound about the nature of financial flow itself. Money, unlike many other desires, is ultimately about circulation and movement. The metaphor of water is precise. Money, like water, seeks its own level and flows naturally toward points of least resistance. When you assume the consciousness of abundance, you remove the internal resistance that blocks financial flow. The person who desperately needs money creates energetic barriers through their very desperation. They assume scarcity, expect difficulty, and approach financial opportunities from a consciousness of lack. This assumption of limitation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, creating exactly the financial struggles they fear. Conversely, the person who assumes abundance approaches the same opportunities from an entirely different consciousness. They expect success, recognize value where others see problems, and make decisions from confidence rather than fear. Their assumption of financial well-being creates a magnetic quality that attracts opportunities, partnerships, and resources. Modern examples of this principle abound in the entrepreneurial world, though few recognize the consciousness principles at work. The startup founder who raises millions in venture capital often begins with nothing more than an assumption, a complete conviction that their vision will succeed. They assume the feeling of success so completely that investors sense it and want to participate. The assumption becomes so real to them that they communicate it with natural authority, making others believe as well. The cryptocurrency phenomenon demonstrates collective assumption on a massive scale. Digital currencies with no inherent value achieve trillion-dollar market capitalizations purely through collective assumption, millions of people assuming these digital tokens have worth, creating the very value they assume exists. The assumption of scarcity drives prices higher as more people assume the tokens will become more valuable. When assumption shifts toward worthlessness, prices collapse with equal rapidity. This reveals why money flows like water. It moves according to the patterns of consciousness that surround it. Fear consciousness creates financial drought. Abundance consciousness creates financial flow. The mechanism operates not through mystical forces, but through the natural responsiveness of reality to consciousness itself. The person who practices the 4-minute protocol with financial goals soon discovers that money arrives through unexpected channels. The raise they had not requested gets offered. The investment they had forgotten about pays unexpected dividends. The business opportunity presents itself through a chance conversation. The debt they had written off gets repaid with interest. These are not coincidences, but the natural operation of assumption hardening into fact. What appears supernatural is actually the recognition of how reality has always operated. Most people create their financial circumstances unconsciously through habitual assumptions about money, worth, and possibility. The conscious practitioner simply directs this same creative power with intention and awareness. At the deepest level of reality, consciousness and matter are not separate phenomena, but different aspects of a single creative process. Modern physics, particularly quantum mechanics, has begun to uncover what mystical traditions have taught for millennia, that consciousness plays a fundamental role in determining what becomes manifest in physical experience. The observer effect demonstrates that the act of observation changes the behavior of subatomic particles. What appears to be solid matter is revealed to be mostly empty space, held together by forces that exist primarily as probability waves until consciousness collapses them into definite states. Reality at its foundation is far more fluid and responsive to consciousness than our everyday experience suggests. This understanding transforms the question from how can imagination affect reality to how could imagination not affect reality? If consciousness is fundamental to the structure of existence itself, then changing consciousness necessarily changes experience. The law of assumption operates not by violating natural law, but by utilizing the deepest natural law of all, that consciousness creates reality. Yet this recognition carries profound implications for how we understand power, responsibility, and social structure. If individuals can consciously direct their experience through assumption, what does this mean for systems of control that depend on people believing they are powerless? The advertising industry, political systems, and economic structures all operate by shaping collective assumptions about what is possible, desirable, and necessary. Those who understand assumption as a creative principle recognize that much of what appears as external authority is actually internalized assumption. The person who assumes they must struggle financially will find evidence everywhere to support that assumption. The person who assumes abundance will find equal evidence for their assumption. Neither is seeing objective reality. Both are experiencing the reality created by their consciousness. This creates what might be called the reality engineering phenomenon, the deliberate manipulation of collective assumptions to create social and economic outcomes. Mass media shapes assumptions about what constitutes success, happiness, and security. Educational systems shape assumptions about intelligence, capability, and potential. Political systems shape assumptions about power, representation, and possibility. Yet the same principle that can be used to limit can be used to liberate. The person who recognizes their own consciousness as the creative power behind their experience becomes sovereign in the truest sense, not dependent on external circumstances for their well-being, but capable of assuming whatever internal state will create the external conditions they desire. This understanding reveals why certain knowledge has been both preserved and suppressed throughout history. Mystery schools and mystical traditions have maintained these teachings because they represent the deepest truth about human potential. Yet the same knowledge has often been kept hidden because widespread understanding of consciousness as creative power would fundamentally alter social and economic structures built on the assumption of human limitation. The person who assumes abundance does not merely become wealthy, they become dangerous to systems that profit from scarcity consciousness. The person who assumes health does not merely recover from illness, they challenge medical establishments built on assumptions of fragility. The person who assumes their own creative power does not merely manifest their desires, they demonstrate the possibility that every human being possesses the same capacity. What emerges from this understanding is not a new technique for getting what you want, but a recognition of what you have always been, consciousness itself, forever creating reality through whatever you assume to be true about yourself and your world. The modern world presents a peculiar paradox. Never before have so many people had access to teachings about consciousness and manifestation, yet never before have so many felt powerless over their circumstances. The spiritual marketplace overflows with courses, books, and seminars promising to reveal the secrets of attraction and manifestation. Yet most people who engage with these teachings find themselves cycling through technique after technique, system after system, without ever experiencing the fundamental shift in consciousness that creates lasting change. This proliferation of spiritual techniques often obscures the simple truth at the heart of all genuine transformation. You do not need more methods, more information, or more practices. You need to recognize that consciousness is the only reality, and that what you assume to be true about yourself becomes your experience. Everything else is commentary, elaboration, or distraction from this central recognition. The current economic climate of uncertainty and anxiety makes this understanding more relevant than ever. Millions of people feel trapped by financial circumstances, limited by job markets, or constrained by economic systems that seem beyond their control. Yet these same people possess within their own consciousness the power to assume abundance, to expect opportunity, and to create the very financial flow they believe is missing from their lives. The responsibility that comes with this recognition can be overwhelming. If you are truly the creator of your own experience through your assumptions, what does this mean about the circumstances you have experienced? What does it mean about the struggles, the limitations, the disappointments that have shaped your life? The initial response is often resistance. Surely external factors, other people's choices, and random circumstances play a role in what happens to you. Yet this resistance itself reveals the depth of assumption that keeps most people trapped in limitation. The assumption that you are victim to circumstances is perhaps the most limiting assumption of all. It may feel humble, realistic, or even noble to believe that forces beyond your control determine your experience, but this assumption of powerlessness becomes the very thing that makes you powerless. The integration of this understanding with practical action requires a delicate balance. Assuming your wish fulfilled does not mean abandoning intelligent action or ignoring practical considerations. Rather, it means taking action from the assumption that success is inevitable, rather than from the assumption that you must struggle to achieve it. The person who assumes abundance approaches opportunities with confidence, makes decisions from security rather than fear, and persists through temporary setbacks because they know their assumption must ultimately manifest. This is not about replacing practical wisdom with wishful thinking. This is about recognizing that your assumptions determine which practical actions you take, how you take them, and what results they produce. The same action taken from an assumption of limitation produces different results than the same action taken from an assumption of abundance. The invitation to test these principles safely lies in beginning with small assumptions, circumstances where you can afford to be wrong, desires that do not carry overwhelming emotional charge. Assume the feeling of finding a parking space, of receiving unexpected good news, of having a pleasant conversation with someone who is usually difficult. These smaller tests allow you to develop confidence in the principle without risking your sense of security or well-being. As your understanding deepens through direct experience, you begin to recognize that you have been using this principle all along, though unconsciously. Every limitation you experience reflects an assumption you have accepted as true. Every area of your life that flows smoothly reflects assumptions of ease and naturalness. The difference between conscious and unconscious creation is simply awareness of the process. The ultimate recognition is that you are not seeking to acquire power over circumstances. You are seeking to recognize the power you have always possessed. Consciousness is not something you have. Consciousness is what you are. And consciousness, when it assumes something to be true, creates the conditions necessary for that assumption to manifest in experience. The water flows not because you have learned a technique, but because you have recognized what you have always been, the creative power that shapes reality through whatever you assume to be true about yourself. In this recognition, the 4 minutes of practice become not a means to an end, but a celebration of the creative power that has always belonged to you. Every human being stands at this choice point in every moment, to create consciously or unconsciously, to assume limitation or possibility, to live from fear or from the recognition of their own creative power. The world around you is not fixed, solid, or independent. It is the reflection of collective human consciousness, and it changes as consciousness changes. When you assume your wish fulfilled and persist in that assumption until it feels natural, you are not violating the laws of reality. You are utilizing the fundamental law upon which all others depend. Consciousness creates reality, and what you are conscious of being, you become. This is not philosophy or metaphysics. This is the practical foundation of all human experience. The man who closed his eyes in that cramped apartment and assumed abundance was not performing a ritual or practicing a technique. He was recognizing what he had always been, consciousness itself, forever creating reality through whatever he assumed to be true. The money that flowed to him was not attracted from outside his experience, but manifested from within his own creative power. You are that same consciousness. You possess that same creative power. In every moment, through every assumption you accept as true about yourself, you are creating your world. The question is not whether this principle works. It is always working, creating your experience according to your assumptions. The question is whether you will direct it consciously or allow it to operate through unconscious habit and external influence.